Hello, dear Sleepyheads. Tonight, we journey back to the dawn of civilization itself, to the ancient city of Uruk, where the first great hero's tale was carved into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago. This is the story of a king who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, whose quest for immortality became humanity's first epic poem. A tale of friendship, loss, and the acceptance of our mortal nature. Before we begin this ancient journey, I want to thank you for joining me in these quiet hours. If these stories bring you peace and help you drift into restful sleep, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps me continue creating these gentle voyages through history. Now close your eyes and let us walk the dusty streets of ancient Mesopotamia, where between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the world's first cities rose from the fertile mud, and where a king named Gilgamesh first learned what it means to be human. The morning sun cast long shadows across the massive walls of Uruk as the priests of Anu climbed the steps of the great ziggurat, their white linen robes rustling in the warm Mesopotamian breeze. It was the year we now call 2700 BCE, though the people of that time measured their days by the flooding of the great rivers and the movements of stars across the endless sky. From the highest temple, they could see the entire world as they knew it. Endless fields of barley and wheat stretching to the horizon, date palms swaying along irrigation canals, and the mighty Euphrates flowing like a silver ribbon toward the distant sea. But their prayers that morning were not of gratitude for the abundant harvest or the peaceful flow of the rivers. Instead, they lifted their voices in desperate supplication to the gods above, begging for relief from the tyranny of their own king. For Uruk, the greatest city in the world, was ruled by a man whose strength was beyond mortal measure, whose beauty was like that of the gods themselves, but whose heart had grown hard with power and pride. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, stood 7 cubits tall, with shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of heaven itself. His hair was black as the night sky, braided with golden threads that caught the sunlight like captured stars. His eyes held the depth of ancient wisdom, for he was born of both divine and mortal blood. His mother Ninsun was a goddess, wise and beautiful beyond all earthly women, while his father Lugalbanda had been a mortal king whose deeds were already becoming legend. The palace where Gilgamesh held court was itself a wonder of the ancient world. Built from baked bricks that gleamed like jewels in the sunlight, its walls was decorated with magnificent reliefs showing the king in combat with lions and bulls, scenes that celebrated his strength while reminding all who entered of his power over both beast and man. The throne room stretched higher than the tallest cedar trees, its ceiling supported by massive pillars carved with the images of protective spirits and the flowing script that recorded the king's great deeds. Yet for all its magnificence, the palace had become a place of fear for the people of Uruk. The king's demands upon his subjects had grown ever more unreasonable and harsh. He claimed the right to any bride on her wedding night, leaving broken hearts and shattered families in his wake. He conscripted the young men of the city for endless building projects, working them until they collapsed from exhaustion under the merciless sun. No festival could be held without his permission. No merchant could trade without paying tribute to his treasury. No citizen could rest while their king pursued his endless appetite for glory and pleasure. The streets of Uruk, which should have buzzed with the happy commerce of the world's first great city, instead echoed with whispered complaints and muffled sobs. Mothers hid their sons from the king's recruiters. Fathers barricaded their doors when wedding processions passed by, and the elderly remembered better times when kings served their people rather than enslaving them. The very walls that protected the city from external enemies had become a prison for those trapped within. In the workshops where craftsmen created the world's first works of art and literature, where scribes developed the very first system of writing that would preserve human thoughts for all eternity, the atmosphere was one of oppression rather than creativity. The potters shaped their clay with trembling hands, knowing that any piece judged unsatisfactory by the king might result in brutal punishment. The metalworkers forged weapons and jewelry under the constant threat of having their finest works confiscated for the royal treasury. The great marketplace, where merchants from distant lands brought exotic goods from the ends of the earth, had become a place of fear rather than wonder. Traders told stories of other cities, where kings ruled with justice and wisdom, where people prospered under fair laws and reasonable taxes. These tales only served to highlight the growing desperation of Uruk's citizens, who began to wonder if they would ever know such happiness in their own city. But it was in the sacred precincts of the temples that the people's despair found its most eloquent expression. The priests of Anu, god of the sky and father of all gods, offered daily sacrifices and endless prayers for divine intervention. They burned incense made from precious resins, offered the finest barley and dates, and sang hymns that had been passed down since the beginning of time. Their supplications rose like smoke from the altar fires, carrying the anguish of an entire population to the ears of the gods. The goddess Aruru, she who had shaped the first humans from clay, heard these prayers as she walked through the celestial gardens where the gods took their rest. The lamentations of Uruk's people reached her divine heart like arrows of sorrow, each prayer a reminder of the sacred bond between ruler and ruled that had been so grievously broken. She understood that something must be done to restore balance to the world below, for the harmony of heaven and earth depended upon justice among mortals. In her wisdom, Aruru conceived a plan that would challenge Gilgamesh's arrogance while giving him the opportunity to discover his true nature. She would create a companion for the king, someone whose strength could match his own, whose spirit could stand against his tyranny, and whose friendship might awaken the nobility that still slumbered within the royal heart. This companion would be wild and free, untainted by the corruption of civilization, a mirror in which Gilgamesh might see both his own potential for greatness and his current failings. The creation of this new being would require all of Aruru's divine skill and wisdom. She gathered clay from the banks of the Euphrates, where the river's ancient waters had deposited the essence of the earth itself. She mixed this clay with the pure water that flowed from the springs of the paradise, adding her own divine breath to give it life and consciousness. As she worked, she sang the ancient songs of creation, the same melodies that had accompanied the birth of the world and all its creatures. When her work was complete, there stood before her a man unlike any who had ever walked the earth. He was as tall and strong as Gilgamesh himself, but his hair flowed long and wild like a lion's mane, and his body was covered with thick hair like the beasts of the field. His eyes held the wisdom of the wilderness, the knowledge of every creature that ran or flew or crawled upon the earth. He knew nothing of cities or kings, of writing or warfare, of the complexities and corruptions that had transformed simple human nature into the twisted desires of civilized men. Aruru named him Enkidu, meaning creation of Anu, and she placed him in the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the walls of human settlements. There he would live among the wild animals, drinking from the same streams, eating the same grasses and fruits, sharing in the simple, honest existence that the gods had originally intended for all their children. He would protect the innocent creatures from the hunters and trappers who came from the cities to satisfy the endless appetites of civilized men. The deer and gazelles gathered around Enkidu as if he were their brother, trusting in his gentle nature and his commitment to their welfare. The lions and leopards accepted him as an equal, recognizing in him the same wild spirit that drove them through their daily struggle for survival. Even the great aurochs, those mighty wild bulls whose strength was legendary throughout the ancient world, acknowledged his dominance and followed his lead when he guided them to fresh pastures and clean water. For many seasons, Enkidu lived in perfect harmony with the natural world, knowing nothing of the troubles that plagued the cities of men. He learned the secret languages of all the animals, understood the subtle signs that predicted changes in weather and season, and developed an intimate knowledge of every plant and tree in his vast domain. His strength grew with each passing day, nourished by the pure air and clean water of the wilderness, exercised in friendly competition with the strongest beasts of the field. But the goddess Aruru knew that this peaceful existence was only the first phase of her plan. Enkidu's destiny lay not in the wilderness, but in the great city of Uruk, where his meeting with Gilgamesh would set in motion events that would transform both men and ultimately restore justice to the land. The wild man's innocence and purity would serve as a mirror for the king's corruption, while his strength would provide the first real challenge to Gilgamesh's physical dominance. The wheel of fate had been set in motion, and soon the paths of the civilized king and the wild man would cross in a confrontation that would echo through the ages. The citizens of Uruk continued their prayers, unaware that their salvation was already taking shape in the form of a man who ran with wolves and spoke the secret language of the wind. The stage was set for the greatest friendship in human history, a bond that would teach both men the true meaning of courage, loyalty, and the acceptance of mortality. In the palace of Uruk, Gilgamesh slept fitfully on his golden bed, his dreams filled with strange visions of forests and wild creatures, of a figure approaching through the morning mist whose face he could never quite see. The king's restless sleep was itself a sign that the gods had heard their people's prayers, and that change was coming to the greatest city in the world. The hunter Shamhat moved silently through the reed marshes at the edge of the wilderness, her practiced eye scanning the landscape for signs of the animals that provided her livelihood. She had been tracking a herd of wild aurochs for 3 days, following their trail across rocky hills and through dense thickets, waiting for the perfect moment to set her traps. These magnificent beasts, with their massive horns and powerful shoulders, were prized throughout Mesopotamia for their strength and ferocity. But they were also extremely difficult to catch. As the daughter of one of Uruk's most skilled trappers, Shamhat had learned her craft from childhood, studying the habits of every creature that roamed the vast wilderness beyond the city's walls. She could read tracks in sand and mud as easily as the scribes read their cuneiform tablets, could predict an animal's movements by observing the wind and weather, and could fashion snares and traps from materials found in the wild. Her success had made her wealthy by the standards of her profession, but more importantly, it had earned her the respect of hunters throughout the region. But on this particular morning, as she crept closer to the watering hole where the aurochs gathered at dawn, Shamhat witnessed something that would change the course of her life and ultimately alter the fate of kings. There, drinking peacefully among the great bulls, was a figure that appeared to be human, yet moved with the grace and naturalness of a wild animal. His long hair flowed like a mane, his powerful body was covered with coarse hair, and his eyes held the alert, intelligent gaze of a creature perfectly adapted to life in the wilderness. The hunter watched in amazement as this wild man communicated with the aurochs through gestures and sounds that seemed to carry meaning beyond human understanding. When the herd moved on to fresh pastures, he followed them as naturally as if he were one of their own offspring. When young calves strayed too far from their mothers, he gently guided them back to safety. When predators approached, he positioned himself between them and the more vulnerable members of the herd, his presence alone enough to discourage any attack. Shamhat followed at a respectful distance, her professional instincts overcoming her amazement as she observed this extraordinary being. She watched him fill in the pit traps she had carefully concealed, untangle snares that would have caught unwary animals, and lead entire herds away from areas where hunters were likely to operate. His protection of the wild creatures was complete and effective, making it nearly impossible for any trapper to succeed in the regions where he roamed. As the days passed, Shamhat began to understand the full extent of the problem this wild man represented for her and her fellow hunters. His interference had made large areas of the wilderness completely inaccessible to their traditional practices. Herds that had been reliable sources of income for generations were now beyond reach, protected by a guardian whose strength and intelligence surpassed anything the trappers had ever encountered. The economic impact was severe. Hunters returned to Uruk empty-handed, their families facing hunger and poverty as their primary source of income disappeared. The markets that had always been well-stocked with fresh meat and valuable hides now suffered from shortages that drove prices beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. The leather workers who depended on animal hides for their craft found themselves unable to practice their trade, while the bone carvers and horn workers faced similar difficulties. More disturbing than the economic effects, however, were the stories that began to circulate about the wild man's supernatural abilities. Hunters reported that he could communicate with animals in their own languages, that his footprints left no trace on even the softest ground, and that he possessed strength far beyond that of normal men. Some claimed he could run faster than the swiftest gazelle, leap across rivers in a single bound, and wrestle with lions as if they were house cats. Shamhat listened to these tales with the skepticism of a professional who understood how fear and failure could transform ordinary events into supernatural encounters. But her own observations confirmed that this wild man was indeed something extraordinary, a being whose very existence challenged the natural order that hunters had always taken for granted. His protection of the animals was absolute and effective, suggesting powers that went far beyond normal human capabilities. After many days of careful observation, Shamhat made a decision that would prove crucial to the unfolding of destiny. Rather than continuing to hunt in increasingly barren territories, she would return to Uruk and report her discoveries to the authorities. The wild man represented a problem too large for individual hunters to solve, requiring the attention of the city's leaders and perhaps even divine intervention. The journey back to Uruk took her through landscapes that showed clear evidence of the wild man's influence. Areas that had once teemed with game now showed only the tracks of animals passing through safely, no longer lingering in places where hunters might threaten them. Water holes that had been reliable hunting grounds for generations now served their original purpose of simply providing refreshment for thirsty creatures, unmarked by the blood and struggle that had characterized them in the past. The massive walls of Uruk rose before Shamhat like a mountain of baked brick, their imposing height and thickness a testament to the city's power and wealth. The great gates stood open during the daylight hours, allowing merchants, farmers, and craftsmen to pass freely between the city and the surrounding countryside. Guards in bronze armor and carrying spears tipped with iron examined the more valuable caravans, but allowed local citizens like Shamhat to enter without hindrance. The streets of Uruk bustled with activity, despite the underlying tensions created by the king's oppressive rule. Merchants hawked their wares from colorful stalls, children played in the dusty alleys between houses, and craftsmen worked at their trades in workshops open to the street. The sound of hammering from the metal workers, the rhythmic thudding of looms from the textile makers, and the scraping of tools from the stone carvers created a symphony of productivity that spoke to the city's fundamental vitality. But beneath this surface activity, Shamhat could sense the fear and resentment that had begun to poison the atmosphere of what should have been the world's greatest city. People spoke in whispers, glanced nervously over their shoulders, and hurried about their business with the anxious urgency of those who lived under constant threat. The joy and celebration that should have marked daily life in such a prosperous place had been replaced by a grim determination simply to survive another day under their tyrannical king. The palace complex dominated the center of the city like a small mountain, its walls rising tier upon tier toward the heavens where the gods were said to dwell. The ziggurat of Anu reached even higher, its steps leading up to the sacred shrine where priests conducted the rituals that maintained the harmony between heaven and earth. From this elevated perspective, the city spread out in all directions, a testament to human achievement and divine favor. Shamhat made her way through the increasingly crowded streets toward the district where the royal officials conducted their daily business. The palace guards, resplendent in their polished bronze and gold, stood at attention beside every entrance, their presence a constant reminder of the king's absolute authority. Petitioners and supplicants gathered in the outer courtyards, hoping for an audience with someone who might address their grievances or grant their requests. The bureaucracy of Uruk was itself a marvel of organization and efficiency, with scribes maintaining detailed records of every aspect of city life. Tax collectors tracked the income from every trade and profession, while census takers recorded the movements of populations and the changes in family structures. Military officers coordinated the training and equipment of the city's defenders, while diplomatic envoys maintained relationships with neighboring cities and distant kingdoms. It was to this complex administrative apparatus that Shamhat brought her report about the wild man whose interference was disrupting the hunting industry. She understood that her observations might seem incredible to those who had never ventured far from the city's walls, but she also knew that the economic impact of the problem was too severe to ignore. The officials would need to take action, whether they believed in the supernatural aspects of the situation or not. The junior administrator who received her report listened with the patient attention of someone accustomed to hearing complaints and requests from citizens. He asked detailed questions about the locations where the interference had occurred, the specific methods the wild man used to protect the animals, and the economic losses that hunters had suffered as a result. His careful note-taking suggested that the matter would receive serious consideration from higher authorities. As Shamhat left the administrative complex and walked back through the streets of Uruk, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. From a simple hunter tracking aurochs in the wilderness, she had become the bearer of news that might reach the ears of the king himself. The wild man she had discovered represented a mystery that touched on the fundamental relationship between civilization and nature, between the ordered world of the city and the chaotic freedom of the wilderness. The sun was setting over Uruk as Shamhat reached her family's modest home in the Crafters' Quarter, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the city's countless brick walls and flat rooftops. The evening call to prayer echoed from the ziggurats, calling the faithful to remember their obligations to the gods who watched over the city's prosperity and peace. In the distance, the Euphrates flowed peacefully toward the sea, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of all who lived along its banks. But Shamhat knew that this apparent tranquility was deceptive, that forces were stirring both in the wilderness and in the palace that would soon transform the quiet routines of daily life into something far more dramatic and dangerous. The wild man whose story she had brought to the attention of the authorities represented only the beginning of changes that would affect every citizen of Uruk, from the humblest farmer to the king himself. The temple of Ishtar rose like a beacon of divine beauty from the heart of Uruk, its walls adorned with glazed bricks that depicted the goddess in all her magnificent forms. As the patroness of love, fertility, and war, Ishtar commanded the devotion of all who sought her blessings, from young lovers praying for happiness to warriors requesting courage in battle. The sacred courtyard surrounding her temple bustled with activity as priests and priestesses conducted the daily rituals that maintained the goddess's favor toward the city and its people. Among the most honored servants of Ishtar was Shamhat, the temple courtesan, whose name was the same as the hunter, but whose calling was entirely different. This Shamhat had been chosen in childhood for her exceptional beauty and intelligence, trained in the sacred arts that would allow her to serve as a bridge between the human and divine realms. Her education had included not only the physical techniques of love, but also instruction in music, poetry, literature, and the subtle arts of conversation that made her a valued companion to men of all social classes. The role of the sacred courtesan was one of the most respected positions a woman could hold in ancient Mesopotamian society. Unlike common prostitutes who sold their bodies for simple commerce, the temple courtesans were considered holy women whose intimate services carried divine blessing. They were skilled into arts of pleasure, not merely for physical gratification, but as a form of worship that honored the goddess and brought spiritual fulfillment to those who sought their company. Shamhat's chamber within the temple complex was a marvel of luxury and artistic refinement. Silk cushions imported from distant lands covered low couches carved from precious woods and inlaid with ivory and gold. The walls were decorated with scenes from the sacred marriage rites that celebrated the union of divine and mortal, while precious perfumes and oils filled the air with fragrances that were said to please the goddess herself. Soft music from unseen musicians provided a constant background of harmony and peace. On the morning when the hunter's report reached the ears of the king's advisers, Shamhat was conducting her daily devotions before the golden statue of Ishtar that dominated her chamber. She offered prayers for the city's prosperity, for the happiness of lovers throughout the world, and for her own continued ability to serve the goddess with dignity and skill. The ritual burning of precious incense accompanied her prayers, sending sweet smoke toward the heavens, where the gods dwelt in eternal bliss. The summons that came from the palace was delivered by a royal messenger, whose nervous demeanor suggested the urgency of his mission. The king's counselors required her immediate attendance for a matter of great importance to the security and prosperity of the city. Such summons were not unusual, as the sacred courtesans were often consulted on matters involving human nature and motivation, their deep understanding of the human heart making them valuable advisors on complex situations. The palace corridors through which Shamhat walked were themselves works of art, their walls covered with magnificent reliefs that depicted the great deeds of past kings and the favor of the gods toward the royal line. The artistic skill of Uruk's craftsmen was evident in every detail, from the perfectly proportioned figures to the intricate patterns that bordered each scene. The very stones seemed to whisper of the power and glory that had made Uruk the greatest city in the world. The council chamber where she was received was circular in design, its domed ceiling painted with stars that mirrored the actual constellations visible in the night sky. Around the walls stood statues of the great kings of the past, their stone eyes seeming to watch and judge the proceedings that took place in their presence. The current king's throne dominated the far end of the room, its golden surface reflecting the light of oil lamps that burned perpetually in honor of the royal presence. Gilgamesh himself was absent from this particular meeting, conducting military exercises beyond the city walls, but his chief counselor, Urshanabe, spoke with the full authority of the crown. A man of advanced years, whose wisdom was legendary throughout the region, Urshanabe had served 3 kings with distinction and was respected even by those who feared and resented the current monarch's tyrannical rule. His white beard and gentle manner concealed a sharp intelligence that had guided Uruk through many crises. The problem presented to Shamhat was unlike anything in her experience, yet her training had prepared her to deal with unusual situations that required both wisdom and courage. The wild man described by the hunter represented a threat to the city's economic stability, but he also presented an opportunity that might serve larger purposes. The counselors had concluded that conventional military force would be ineffective against someone who could command the loyalty of wild animals and who possessed supernatural strength and speed. Instead, they proposed a different approach, one that would draw upon the sacred arts in which Shamhat was trained. The wild man's innocence and isolation from human society made him vulnerable to the civilizing influence of love and companionship. If Shamhat could gain his trust and affection, she might be able to lead him away from his animal companions and into the human world, where his remarkable abilities could be channeled toward constructive rather than disruptive purposes. The plan required considerable courage and skill, as it would involve venturing into the wilderness alone to seek out a being whose powers were unknown and whose reaction to human contact was unpredictable. Shamhat would need to use all her training in the arts of attraction and persuasion, while also relying on the protection of Ishtar to shield her from any danger she might encounter. The mission was voluntary, but its importance to the city's welfare made it a sacred duty that she could not refuse. Shamhat accepted the assignment with the calm dignity that characterized all her actions, understanding that she was being called to serve not only her city, but also the goddess whose gifts she had been chosen to share with the world. The preparations for her mission were elaborate and careful, involving both practical arrangements for her safety and spiritual preparations that would ensure divine protection during her dangerous journey. The sacred vestments she would wear were chosen for their symbolic significance as well as their beauty. Robes of the finest silk, dyed in the colors sacred to Ishtar, would announce her divine affiliation to any who saw her. Jewelry of gold and precious stones would serve not only as protection against evil spirits, but also as offerings that could be given to secure the cooperation of wilderness deities. Perfumes and oils, blessed by the priests, would carry the scent of civilization into the wild lands where human presence was rare. The 3 days of purification that preceded her departure were spent in prayer, meditation, and ritual cleansing that would prepare her spirit for the challenges ahead. She fasted during the daylight hours, consuming only pure water and honey, while the nights were devoted to sacred dances and songs that honored Ishtar and requested her guidance. The other temple courtesans joined in these observances, their collective prayers creating a web of divine protection around their sister, who was about to undertake such a dangerous mission. The priests of Anu and Enlil also participated in the preparations, offering sacrifices and burning incense to ensure that all the gods would look favorably upon the enterprise. The successful completion of Shamhat's mission was seen as crucial not only to the immediate problem of the wild man, but also to the larger question of the king's relationship with his people. If the current crisis could be resolved through wisdom and divine intervention rather than force and oppression, it might provide a model for addressing other problems that plagued the city. The supplies provided for her journey included not only the practical necessities of food, water, and shelter, but also the tools of her sacred trade. Musical instruments would allow her to create the harmonious atmosphere that encouraged relaxation and trust. Poetry scrolls contained the verses that celebrated love and beauty in language so perfect that it was said to charm even the wildest beasts. Most importantly, she carried vials of the sacred oils that were used in the temple rites, substances so precious that they were said to contain the very essence of divine love. As the day of departure approached, Shamhat spent her final hours in the temple chamber where she had served Ishtar for so many years. The familiar surroundings, from the golden statue of the goddess to the silk cushions where she had entertained countless visitors, seemed to glow with a special radiance that spoke of divine approval for her mission. She understood that her return to this sacred space wasn't guaranteed, but she also knew that her willingness to risk everything in service to her city and her goddess would earn their eternal protection regardless of the outcome. The dawn sky was painted in shades of pink and gold as Shamhat made her final preparations for the journey that would take her far from the security of civilization into the unknown dangers of the wilderness. The blessing of the high priest still echoed in her ears, while the weight of the sacred amulets around her neck reminded her of the divine forces that would accompany her on this extraordinary mission. She was no longer simply a temple courtesan, but a representative of all that was highest and most beautiful in human civilization, carrying the light of the gods into the darkness of the wild lands, where chaos and order would soon meet in a confrontation that would change the world forever. The wilderness stretched endlessly before Shamhat as she left the last cultivated fields behind and entered the realm where only the gods and wild creatures held dominion. Her small party consisted of herself, 2 guides familiar with the borderlands, and a single guard whose bronze spear gleamed in the morning sunlight. They traveled light, carrying only essential supplies and the sacred objects necessary for her divine mission, moving swiftly across terrain that grew increasingly rough and untamed with each passing mile. The landscape through which they journeyed was one of breathtaking beauty and subtle danger. Rolling hills covered with wild grasses gave way to dense thickets, where thorny bushes concealed the pathways used by animals for countless generations. Clear streams bubbled over smooth stones, providing pure water that tasted of the mountain springs from which they flowed. Ancient cedar trees rose like pillars supporting the dome of heaven, their massive trunks scarred by the claws of great bears, and their branches home to eagles whose cries echoed across the valleys. As they penetrated deeper into the wilderness, the party began to encounter signs of the wild man's presence. Trees had been stripped of their bark in patterns that seemed to carry meaning, while rocks had been arranged in configurations that suggested both intelligence and purpose. The very air seemed charged with an energy that spoke of powerful forces at work in these remote places, far from the ordering influence of human civilization. The guides pointed out tracks in the soft earth beside stream banks, footprints that were unmistakably human, yet somehow different from those left by ordinary men. They were larger than normal, pressed deeper into the ground by what must have been tremendous weight, and they showed none of the distortion caused by sandals or boots. These were the feet of someone who had never known the constraints of civilized footwear, whose soles had been toughened by direct contact with every type of terrain. On the second day of their journey, they began to see the animals whose protection had made the wild man famous among hunters throughout the region. Herds of gazelles grazed peacefully in meadows where they should have been constantly alert for predators, while deer approached their camp with a fearlessness that spoke of long immunity from human threats. Even the great aurochs, those massive wild bulls whose strength was legendary, seemed calm and content in a way that their urban cousins could never achieve. The guides, experienced in the ways of the wilderness, recognized the significance of this unnatural peace among creatures that should have been natural enemies. Predators and prey mingled without conflict, united by their shared protection from the one being whose authority they all acknowledged. It was as if some primordial harmony had been restored to the natural world, a return to the golden age when all creatures lived together in perfect peace. As evening approached on the second day, Shamhat made the decision that would determine the success or failure of her mission. She instructed her companions to establish a camp in a clearing beside a stream where the water formed a small pool perfect for bathing, while she prepared to encounter the wild man alone. The guides protested this decision, fearing for her safety, but she reminded them that her mission required the subtle arts of persuasion rather than the crude protection of weapons. The preparations she made were as careful and deliberate as those of a priestess preparing for the most sacred of rituals. She bathed in the clear stream water, using the precious oils and perfumes that had been blessed in Ishtar's temple to anoint her body with fragrances that would announce her divine affiliation to any supernatural beings in the area. Her hair was arranged in the elaborate style favored by the goddess, while her clothing was chosen to emphasize her beauty, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her sacred calling. The sacred objects she arranged around the clearing were positioned according to ancient traditions that governed the meeting of divine and mortal realms. Golden figurines of Ishtar were placed at the cardinal points, their eyes seeming to watch over the space where the encounter would take place. Incense burners filled with precious resins sent sweet smoke towards the heavens, carrying prayers for protection and success. Most importantly, she spread a carpet of silk and precious cloth that would serve as a sacred space where the rituals of love could unfold under divine protection. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the clear sky, Shamhat began the chants and songs that would draw the wild man to her location. Her voice, trained in the musical arts that were part of every temple courtesan's education, carried across the wilderness like a golden thread that could guide lost souls toward salvation. The melodies she sang were ancient beyond memory, passed down through generations of priestesses who had served the goddess of love since the dawn of time. The response came more quickly than she had dared hope. The sound of movement in the surrounding forest announced the approach of someone whose footsteps made no more noise than those of a hunting cat, yet whose presence seemed to fill the entire clearing with a powerful energy. When Enkidu finally emerged from the shadows into the circle of firelight, Shamhat felt her breath catch at the sight of this being who seemed to embody all the wild beauty of the natural world. He was magnificent in a way that no civilized man could ever be, his body perfectly proportioned and hardened by constant exposure to the elements. His long hair flowed like a lion's mane, while his eyes held the depth and clarity of one who had never known deception or corruption. Most striking of all was the complete absence of fear in his manner. He approached her as naturally as he might approach a stream to drink, with the confidence of one who belonged utterly to his environment. The initial moments of their encounter were crucial, requiring all of Shamhat's skill in reading human nature and responding to subtle cues. Enkidu's curiosity about her presence was evident, but so was his wariness of something so obviously foreign to his experience. She moved slowly and gracefully, allowing him to observe her without feeling threatened, while her voice continued the soft chanting that seemed to calm and attract him. The breakthrough came when she began to offer him the simple gifts she had brought for this purpose. Fruits and honey cakes that represented the refinements of civilization while remaining essentially natural in their appeal. Enkidu's acceptance of these offerings marked the beginning of his transformation from wild creature to potential member of human society. His obvious pleasure in the new tastes and textures opened his mind to other experiences that this strange and beautiful being might provide. The arts of love that Shamhat employed were not merely physical, but encompassed the full range of human intimacy and connection. She spoke to him in the gentle voice that mothers used with children, teaching him the basic elements of human language through repetition and demonstration. She showed him how to appreciate music by humming simple melodies while moving in rhythm with the sounds. Most importantly, she demonstrated through her own behavior the complex emotions of affection, desire, and caring that distinguished human relationships from the simpler bonds that existed among animals. As the night progressed, the transformation of Enkidu began in earnest. The simple act of sharing food with another being opened his mind to concepts of hospitality and companionship that had no equivalent in his solitary existence. The touch of human hands, gentle and purposeful, rather than the rough contact of animal play, awakened sensations and emotions that had lain dormant in his wild heart. The physical union that followed was more than mere pleasure. It was a sacred rite that connected Enkidu to the divine forces that governed human civilization. Through Shamhat's skilled ministrations, he experienced for the first time the complex emotions of desire, fulfillment, and the deep contentment that comes from intimate connection with another conscious being. The goddess Ishtar herself seemed to bless their coupling, as the very air around them shimmered with divine energy. For 7 days and 7 nights, Shamhat remained with Enkidu in the wilderness clearing, completing his transformation from wild creature to civilized man. Each day brought new lessons in human behavior, language, and custom. She taught him to appreciate cooked food over the raw flesh he had shared with his animal companions, to enjoy the luxury of soft fabrics against his skin, and to understand the intricate social bonds that made human community possible. The change in Enkidu was profound and irreversible. His animal companions, sensing the alteration in his nature, began to withdraw from his presence. The deer and gazelles that had once followed him trustingly now fled at his approach, recognizing that he was no longer one of them. The great aurochs, whose loyalty had been absolute, refused his guidance and wandered away to seek new grazing grounds beyond his influence. Most painful of all was the rejection by the lions and leopards who had accepted him as their brother. These proud creatures, whose respect had been the foundation of his authority in the wilderness, now saw him as a stranger whose scent carried the taint of civilization. Their departure left Enkidu feeling isolated and confused, caught between 2 worlds and fully belonging to neither. Shamhat recognized the signs of his distress and understood that the time had come to complete his transition by bringing him to the city where his new nature could find its proper expression. She spoke to him of Uruk's wonders, its massive walls that protected countless people, its temples that reached towards the heavens, its markets filled with goods from the ends of the earth. Most importantly, she told him of Gilgamesh, the mighty king whose strength and beauty were legendary throughout the world. The mention of Gilgamesh stirred something deep within Enkidu's transformed consciousness. Perhaps it was simple curiosity about meeting another being whose physical prowess might match his own, or perhaps it was a deeper recognition that his destiny was somehow connected to this king whose fame extended even into the wilderness. Whatever the source of his interest, he agreed to accompany Shamhat to the city that would become his new home. The journey back to civilization retraced the path Shamhat had followed into the wilderness. But for Enkidu, it was a voyage of discovery that revealed the gradual transition from wild nature to human order. The first cultivated fields they encountered seemed miraculous to eyes accustomed only to natural growth, while the irrigation channels that brought water to thirsty crops demonstrated the power of human intelligence to improve upon divine creation. The small villages they passed through provided Enkidu with his first glimpse of human community life. He marveled at the way families worked together to build homes and grow food, at the cooperation between neighbors in times of need, and at the complex social relationships that governed daily life. The children who gathered to stare at this magnificent stranger seemed like exotic creatures to someone who had never before seen human beings in their natural state of innocence and wonder. But it was also during this journey that Enkidu first encountered the darker aspects of civilization that would trouble him throughout his time among humans. He witnessed the grinding poverty of farmers struggling to pay excessive taxes, the fear in people's eyes when royal messengers passed through their villages, and the subtle signs of oppression that marked a population living under tyrannical rule. These observations planted the first seeds of the sense of justice that would drive many of his future actions. As the walls of Uruk rose before them like mountains of brick and stone, Shamhat prepared Enkidu for the overwhelming experience of entering the world's greatest city. She warned him about the crowds and noise, the complex customs and social hierarchies, and most importantly, the absolute authority of the king whose word was law throughout the land. But nothing she could say was adequate preparation for the reality of urban life as experienced by someone who had known only the vast silence and natural rhythms of the wilderness. The great gates of Uruk stood open in the morning sunlight as Shamhat led Enkidu through the massive portal that separated the ordered world of civilization from the chaotic freedom of the wilderness. The wild man's eyes widened with amazement at the sight that greeted him. Streets teeming with more people than he had imagined could exist in all the world. Buildings rising tier upon tier toward the heavens, and the constant din of human activity that never ceased from dawn to dusk. The crowds that filled Uruk's thoroughfares represented every aspect of human society, from wealthy merchants in silk robes to common laborers whose rough clothing spoke of hard physical work. Scribes hurried past, carrying tablets covered with the wedge-shaped marks that preserved human thought for all eternity, while craftsmen displayed their wares in stalls that lined the major streets. The smell of cooking food, burning incense, and human habitation created an olfactory symphony unlike anything in Enkidu's experience. But it was the architecture of the city that truly overwhelmed the newcomer's senses. The massive walls that surrounded Uruk were themselves a wonder of engineering, built from millions of baked bricks laid in courses so precise that they seemed like natural rock formations. The ziggurat of Anu rose from the city's heart like a man-made mountain, its stepped sides leading up to the shrine where priests maintained daily communication with the gods. The palace complex where King Gilgamesh held court dominated the skyline, with its towers and terraced gardens, its golden decorations catching the sunlight and sending brilliant reflections across the surrounding buildings. Even from a distance, the structure radiated the power and wealth that made Uruk the envy of every other city in the known world. Shamhat guided Enkidu through the maze of streets with the confidence of one who had spent her entire life in the urban environment. She pointed out the various districts where different trades and professions had their centers, the metalworkers' quarter, where the ring of hammers on bronze and iron never ceased, the textile district where looms clattered from dawn to dusk, and the scribal schools where young men learned the complex art of writing that made civilization possible. But their destination was not the palace or any of the great public buildings. Instead, Shamhat led Enkidu to a tavern near the city's main gate, a place where travelers from distant lands mingled with local citizens over beer and roasted meat. The establishment was owned by Siduri, a wise woman whose understanding of human nature made her a valuable source of information about everything that happened in the city. The tavern's main room was filled with the comfortable chaos of a popular gathering place. Merchants discussed trade routes over cups of beer, while soldiers on leave from border duty shared stories of their adventures. Local craftsmen relaxed after long days of work, and occasional visitors from foreign lands added exotic accents to the babble of languages that filled the air. The walls were decorated with scenes of feasting and celebration, while oil lamps provided warm light that made everyone look more attractive and content than the harsh sun of midday. Siduri herself was a woman of middle years whose keen eyes missed nothing that happened in her establishment. She had served beer to 3 generations of Uruk's citizens, listening to their troubles and offering the kind of practical wisdom that came from observing human behavior in all its varieties. Her friendship with Shamhat dated back many years, built on mutual respect between 2 women who had learned to thrive in a world dominated by masculine power. The appearance of Enkidu in her tavern created exactly the stir that Shamhat had anticipated. His magnificent physique and wild appearance drew every eye in the room, while whispered conversations speculated about his identity and origins. Some thought he might be a warrior from distant lands, while others wondered if he could be one of the legendary heroes whose deeds were celebrated in epic songs. Siduri approached their table with the mixture of curiosity and caution that characterized her dealings with unusual customers. Her experienced eye took in Enkidu's obvious strength and the strange quality of innocence that marked him as someone unfamiliar with urban sophistication. When Shamhat explained their companion's background, carefully omitting the more supernatural aspects of his story, the tavern keeper's response was one of immediate sympathy for someone struggling to adapt to an alien environment. The beer that Siduri served was unlike anything Enkidu had ever tasted, its complex flavor the result of brewing techniques that had been refined over centuries of experimentation. The bread that accompanied it was soft and well-seasoned, a luxury unknown to someone whose previous diet had consisted entirely of raw fruits and vegetables. Each new taste opened his palate to possibilities he had never imagined, while the warm atmosphere of the tavern provided his first experience of human hospitality. As the evening progressed, and the tavern filled with its regular customers, Enkidu found himself the center of increasingly friendly attention. The initial wariness of the other patrons gave way to curiosity about his background and adventures, while his obvious naivety about urban customs made him an object of protective concern rather than suspicion. Several of the local men took it upon themselves to explain the basics of city life, from the proper way to greet social superiors to the complex etiquette that governed behavior in public places. It was during one of these conversations that the name of King Gilgamesh first came up in a context that revealed the true feelings of the city's population toward their ruler. An elderly craftsman, emboldened by beer and the apparent sympathy of his listeners, began to speak of the king's latest outrages: the seizure of another man's bride on her wedding night, the conscription of young men for unnecessary building projects, and the constant demands for tribute that impoverished families throughout the city. The bitterness in the old man's voice was echoed by others around the table, each adding their own stories of injustice and oppression. Enkidu listened with growing amazement and anger as he learned about the systematic abuse of power that had made life miserable for the very people the king was supposed to protect. His simple understanding of right and wrong, uncomplicated by the sophistication that often paralyzed civilized men, made the situation seem clear and unacceptable. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the street outside, where royal guards were escorting a wedding procession towards the palace. The bride, a young woman of exceptional beauty, walked with downcast eyes, while her family followed in obvious distress. Everyone in the tavern understood what was happening. Another exercise of the king's claimed right to possess any woman who caught his fancy, regardless of her own wishes or existing commitments. Enkidu's reaction was immediate and visceral. Rising from his seat with fluid grace, he moved toward the tavern's entrance with clear intention of intervening in what he saw as an obvious injustice. Shamhat and several of the other patrons attempted to restrain him, explaining that resistance to the king's will was not only futile, but potentially fatal for anyone who attempted it. But Enkidu's sense of justice, developed during his years of protecting innocent animals from predators, could not accept the argument that might made right. His strength allowed him to brush aside the hands that tried to hold him back, while his determination carried him into the street where the royal guards were maintaining order around the unwilling bride. The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. When the guards ordered Enkidu to clear the way, he simply stood his ground with the calm confidence of someone who had never known fear. Their attempts to move him by force proved futile against his supernatural strength, while their threats only hardened his resolve to protect someone he saw as being unjustly persecuted. The news of this unprecedented resistance to royal authority spread through the city with the speed of wildfire. Within hours, crowds had gathered to witness what many saw as the first successful challenge to King Gilgamesh's tyrannical rule. The bride's family wept with gratitude, while other citizens began to speak openly of their hope that someone had finally appeared who could stand against the oppression that had made their lives miserable. Word of the incident reached the palace before nightfall, carried by the humiliated guards who had been unable to complete their mission. King Gilgamesh's initial reaction was one of incredulous anger that anyone would dare to challenge his authority, followed by curiosity about the identity and capabilities of this mysterious stranger. The description of Enkidu's appearance and strength suggested that this was no ordinary rebel, but someone whose very existence posed a fundamental challenge to the king's supremacy. The royal command that went out the following morning was unprecedented in the annals of Uruk. King Gilgamesh would personally confront this upstart who had dared to interfere with royal prerogatives. The announcement created an atmosphere of excitement and terror throughout the city, as citizens anticipated a battle between titans that might determine the future course of their civilization. Preparations for the confrontation took on the character of a festival, with crowds gathering in the great square before the palace where the meeting would take place. Merchants set up stalls to sell food and drink to the spectators, while musicians provided entertainment that helped maintain the crowd's good humor despite the underlying tension. The atmosphere was that of a holiday, the first genuinely joyful occasion the city had experienced in years. Shamhat spent the hours before the confrontation trying to prepare Enkidu for what he would face. She explained the king's reputation for invincibility in combat, his divine heritage that gave him strength beyond that of mortal men, and the possibility that defeat might result in death or permanent exile from the city. But her warnings only strengthened Enkidu's resolve to stand against what he saw as the abuse of power that had made life unbearable for innocent people. As the sun reached its zenith and the appointed hour approached, the great square filled with every citizen of Uruk who could find space to witness the unprecedented event. The palace gates opened with ceremonial solemnity, and King Gilgamesh emerged in all his royal splendor, his golden armor blazing in the sunlight, and his confident bearing announcing his absolute certainty of victory. The two titans faced each other across the square like forces of nature made manifest. Gilgamesh representing the pinnacle of civilized achievement and royal authority. Enkidu embodying the wild freedom and natural justice of the wilderness. The fate of the greatest city in the world hung in the balance as these extraordinary beings prepared to test their strength against each other in a battle that would be remembered for all eternity. The moment when Gilgamesh and Enkidu first locked eyes across the great square of Uruk was like the meeting of two thunderstorms, each recognizing in the other a force equal to his own. The king, resplendent in his golden armor that had been forged by the finest craftsmen in the world, stood with the confident bearing of one who had never known defeat. Across from him, Enkidu wore only a simple robe that Shamhat had provided. But his natural majesty needed no artificial enhancement. The crowd that had gathered to witness this unprecedented confrontation fell silent as the two warriors began their careful approach toward the center of the square. Citizens who had spoken in whispers for years about their hopes for deliverance now held their breath, understanding that they were about to witness something that would change their world forever. The very air seemed charged with divine energy, as if the gods themselves were leaning down from heaven to observe this clash between mortal and divine power. Gilgamesh moved with the practiced grace of a warrior who had trained since childhood in every martial art known to civilization. His bronze spear caught the sunlight as he adjusted his grip, while his shield bore the emblem of Uruk surrounded by scenes of his greatest victories. Every detail of his equipment spoke of royal wealth and superior craftsmanship, from the gold inlays on his armor to the perfectly balanced sword at his side. Enkidu's approach was entirely different, marked by the fluid naturalness of a creature perfectly adapted to physical conflict. He carried no weapons, trusting entirely to the strength of his hands and the quickness of his reflexes. His movements were those of a great cat stalking its prey, each step carefully placed and each muscle ready to explode into violent action. The scars on his arms and chest told stories of battles with lions and bears, contests that had prepared him for this ultimate test. The initial clash when they came together was like the collision of mountains, the sound of their impact echoing off the palace walls and seeming to shake the very foundations of the city. Gilgamesh's spear thrust, delivered with all the skill of a master warrior, was caught and turned aside by Enkidu's bare hands, while the wild man's answering blow sent the king staggering backward despite his divine heritage. What followed was a contest of such intensity and duration that it seemed to transcend the merely physical realm and enter the domain of legend. For hours they struggled, each testing the other's strength, speed, and endurance in ways that pushed both warriors beyond the limits of normal human capability. The royal spear was broken early in the fight, discarded as useless when Enkidu demonstrated his ability to catch and redirect any conventional weapon. The wrestling match that developed when they abandoned all weapons became a thing of terrible beauty, a perfect expression of masculine power and skill that held the watching crowd in awed silence. They grappled through the square, their feet leaving deep impressions in the hard-packed earth, their bodies straining against each other with forces that could have crushed ordinary men. Neither could gain a decisive advantage, as every hold was met with an equally skillful counter. Every throw answered with a recovery that seemed to defy the laws of physics. As the afternoon wore on and both warriors began to show signs of exhaustion, something remarkable began to happen. The initial fury of their combat gave way to a grudging respect for each other's abilities, then to something approaching admiration for an opponent who could match their own legendary prowess. The crowd sensed this change, recognizing that what had begun as a battle to the death was evolving into something entirely different. The moment of transformation came when Gilgamesh, attempting a particularly complex throw, found himself overextended and vulnerable to a counterattack that could have ended the fight decisively. Instead of pressing his advantage, Enkidu hesitated, his natural sense of fairness preventing him from taking advantage of what might have been a momentary accident. This gesture of sportsmanship touched something deep in the king's heart, awakening the nobility of character that had been buried under years of unchecked power and pride. When they separated and stood facing each other again, both breathing heavily from their exertions, the quality of their regard for each other had changed completely. Where there had been hostility and competitive fury, there was now recognition of kinship between two beings who understood what it meant to possess strength far beyond that of ordinary mortals. The loneliness that each had carried throughout his life, the isolation of being unique in a world of lesser beings, dissolved in the presence of someone who could truly understand their burden. Gilgamesh was the first to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square as he acknowledged what everyone present had witnessed. "Never before have I met a man whose strength could match my own," he declared, his words carrying the ring of absolute sincerity. "You are indeed mighty, Enkidu, and worthy of the friendship of kings. Let us no longer be enemies but brothers, united in strength and purpose." Enkidu's response came not in words, but in actions. Stepping forward, he embraced the king with the same wholehearted commitment he had once given to protecting the animals of the wilderness. The gesture was so natural and genuine that it seemed to heal the bitter divisions that had poisoned the atmosphere of Uruk for so many years. The crowd that had gathered to witness a battle found themselves instead observing the birth of history's greatest friendship. The transformation in Gilgamesh's demeanor was immediate and profound. The arrogance and cruelty that had characterized his behavior for years seemed to melt away in the warmth of genuine companionship. For the first time since childhood, he had found someone who could relate to him as an equal, someone whose strength and courage made him worthy of respect rather than mere submission. The loneliness that had driven him to increasingly desperate attempts to assert his dominance was replaced by the joy of shared understanding. The celebration that followed their reconciliation was spontaneous and heartfelt, as the citizens of Uruk recognized that their prayers had been answered in an unexpected way. Instead of overthrowing their king, the wild man had transformed him into someone who might actually deserve their loyalty and affection. The feast that Gilgamesh ordered in honor of his new brother was the first genuinely joyful royal occasion the city had experienced in living memory. The palace banquet hall, which had so often been the scene of forced revelry and fearful compliance with royal wishes, now rang with genuine laughter and celebration. The finest foods and wines were brought forth not as displays of royal power, but as offerings of hospitality worthy of the honored guest who had brought such a remarkable change to their king. Musicians played with enthusiasm rather than obligation, while dancers moved with the natural grace of those celebrating a truly happy occasion. But it was in the quieter moments, when the two friends sat together away from the crowds and ceremony, that the true depth of their bond became apparent. They shared stories of their vastly different backgrounds, Gilgamesh speaking of the burdens of kingship and divine heritage, Enkidu describing the freedom and simplicity of life in the wilderness. Each found in the other's experiences a perspective that enlarged his understanding of what it meant to be alive in the world. The king's questions about life among the animals revealed a deep longing for the kind of authentic existence that his royal status had always denied him. Enkidu's descriptions of running with wolves under starlit skies, of sharing the hunt with lions, and of sleeping peacefully beside streams that reflected the moon seemed like tales from paradise to someone who had never known such simple pleasures. Enkidu, in turn, was fascinated by Gilgamesh's accounts of the responsibilities and complexities of ruling a great city. The intricate systems of law and administration, the delicate balance of relationships with neighboring kingdoms, and the burden of making decisions that affected thousands of lives opened his eyes to aspects of human existence he had never imagined. His natural sense of justice was engaged by the king's descriptions of the challenges involved in governing fairly while maintaining the strength necessary to protect the city from its enemies. As the days passed and their friendship deepened, both men began to change in ways that reflected their mutual influence. Gilgamesh's harsh treatment of his subjects gradually gave way to a more just and compassionate style of rule, while his understanding of his responsibilities as king was informed by Enkidu's simple but profound sense of right and wrong. The wild man's presence served as a constant reminder that true strength lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the courage to protect those who could not protect themselves. Enkidu, meanwhile, learned to appreciate the achievements of civilization while maintaining his connection to the natural world that had shaped his character. He became Gilgamesh's most trusted advisor, offering perspectives that no courtier or priest could provide. His understanding of human nature, uncomplicated by the sophistication that often clouded the judgment of educated men, proved invaluable in resolving disputes and making policy decisions. The transformation of Uruk under the influence of their friendship was remarkable to behold. The atmosphere of fear and resentment that had characterized the city for years gave way to a sense of hope and purpose that energized every aspect of urban life. Building projects that had once been sources of oppression became opportunities for citizens to take pride in their city's grandeur. Military exercises that had been demonstrations of royal power evolved into genuine preparations for defending the homeland against external threats. Most importantly, the king's court became a place where justice could actually be achieved rather than merely proclaimed. Enkidu's presence ensured that royal decisions reflected genuine concern for the welfare of all citizens rather than simple expressions of monarchical will. Disputes were resolved based on their merits rather than the influence or wealth of the parties involved, while the needs of the poor and powerless received the same consideration as those of the rich and well-connected. The people of Uruk, who had prayed so desperately for deliverance from tyranny, found their prayers answered in ways they could never have anticipated. The wild man, who had seemed to threaten their king, had instead saved him from the isolation and corruption that had poisoned his character. The friendship between these two extraordinary beings had created the possibility of a golden age in which strength and wisdom would work together for the benefit of all. The peaceful months that followed the forging of friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu brought unprecedented prosperity to Uruk, but they also awakened in both men a restlessness that could not be satisfied by the routine administration of the kingdom. Their daily exercises together in the palace courtyards, where they tested their strength against each other in friendly competition, only served to remind them that their extraordinary abilities seemed destined for greater challenges than those provided by peaceful rule. It was during one of these training sessions, as the two friends wrestled in the shadow of the great ziggurat, while citizens gathered to watch their magnificent displays of strength, that Gilgamesh first spoke of the longing that had begun to consume his thoughts. "My brother," he said, as they paused to rest beside the fountain that cooled the palace gardens, "we have achieved peace in our city and justice for our people. But what shall be remembered of us when we are gone? What great deeds will the bards sing of when they tell the tales of Gilgamesh and Enkidu?" The question touched something deep in Enkidu's heart, awakening echoes of the wild freedom he had once known when every day brought new challenges and adventures. The comfortable routine of palace life, pleasant as it was, could not satisfy the spirit of someone who had once matched strength with the great aurochs and run with wolves under the starlit sky. His love for his friend and his commitment to the people of Uruk remained absolute. But he too felt the call of something greater than the daily round of administrative duties and ceremonial obligations. The king's proposal came like a thunderbolt that illuminated possibilities neither man had dared to contemplate. "There is a forest," Gilgamesh continued, his eyes bright with the enthusiasm of someone who had found the perfect expression for his deepest desires. Far to the west, where the cedars grow taller than our greatest towers, and their shade has never been touched by mortal footsteps, there dwells Humbaba, the guardian appointed by the god Enlil to protect the sacred trees from human interference. The very name of Humbaba sent whispers of awe and terror through the small crowd of courtiers who had gathered to listen to their king's words. The demon guardian of the cedar forest was legendary throughout Mesopotamia, a creature of such supernatural power that even the bravest warriors spoke of him only in hushed voices. His voice was said to be like the roar of floods that could sweep away entire cities, while his breath was the storm wind that uprooted trees and leveled buildings. His face blazed with fire that could blind mortal eyes, and his jaws dripped with the blood of warriors who had dared to challenge his authority. But instead of deterring the two friends, these fearsome descriptions only served to inflame their desire for the ultimate test of their capabilities. Enkidu's warrior spirit, shaped by years of protecting the innocent against natural predators, was stirred by the thought of facing something whose power dwarfed even his own considerable abilities. Gilgamesh, whose divine heritage had always set him apart from ordinary mortals, saw in Humbaba the opportunity to prove that his strength was worthy of his sacred bloodline. The practical benefits of such an expedition were also significant, though they served more as justification than motivation for the two friends. The cedar trees of the distant forest were prized beyond all other timber for their size, beauty, and supernatural resistance to decay. The temples and palaces of Mesopotamia had always been built with imported cedar, but the difficulty and danger of obtaining such wood made it incredibly expensive and rare. A successful expedition could secure enough timber to rebuild every significant structure in Uruk while establishing the city's reputation as the home of heroes willing to face any challenge. The announcement of their intention created a sensation throughout the city that quickly spread to neighboring kingdoms and distant lands. Never before had anyone proposed a deliberate assault on the cedar forest and its supernatural guardian. Previous expeditions had been content to harvest trees from the forest's edges, accepting whatever timber they could gather quickly before Humbaba became aware of their presence. The idea of actually seeking out and confronting the demon guardian seemed to exceed the bounds of human ambition. The priests of all the major temples immediately began elaborate sacrifices and divination ceremonies designed to determine the god's attitude toward such an unprecedented undertaking. The omens they received were complex and contradictory, suggesting both great glory and terrible danger for those who would dare to challenge the appointed guardian of Enlil's sacred grove. Some signs pointed toward divine favor and ultimate success, while others hinted at catastrophe that might engulf not only the expedition, but the entire city of Uruk. The preparations for the journey consumed weeks of intensive activity throughout the city. The royal armory was ransacked for weapons worthy of heroes who would face supernatural enemies, while the finest craftsmen worked day and night to create equipment that could withstand the trials ahead. Swords were forged from the purest metals and blessed by priests of every god who might provide protection. Shields were covered with bronze plates inscribed with protective spells and decorated with images of divine guardians. Most important of all was the creation of special axes designed specifically for cutting the giant cedar trees. These implements needed to be large enough to bite deeply into massive trunks, yet balanced perfectly for effective use by warriors who might need to wield them in combat as well as construction. The metal workers surpassed themselves in creating tools that were both functional and beautiful, their polished surfaces reflecting the skill and pride of artisans working for heroes. The provisioning of the expedition required careful calculation of the supplies needed for a journey of unknown duration through terrain that offered no certainty of game or fresh water. Dried foods that would not spoil in any climate were packed in quantities sufficient to sustain the party for many months, while water skins were prepared to carry enough liquid to survive crossing the desert regions that lay between Uruk and the distant forest. But it was the emotional preparation of the city that proved most challenging for the two friends as they contemplated leaving their home for an adventure from which they might never return. The citizens who had so recently begun to enjoy the benefits of just and compassionate rule now faced the prospect of losing the king whose transformation had brought them such happiness. Their prayers in the temples took on an urgency that moved even the most hardened priests to tears. Shamhat, whose intervention had made possible the friendship that now dominated both men's lives, found herself torn between pride in their courage and terror at the magnitude of the challenge they proposed to face. Her intimate knowledge of Enkidu's capabilities gave her confidence in his ability to survive almost any physical trial. But the supernatural nature of their intended opponent placed the entire enterprise beyond normal human experience. The mothers of Uruk gathered daily at the temple of Ninsun, Gilgamesh's divine mother, offering prayers and sacrifices for the protection of both heroes. The goddess herself was said to appear in dreams to selected priestesses, providing cryptic advice about protective rituals and auspicious timing for the departure. These divine communications, while comforting to the general population, often contained warnings that suggested the magnitude of the dangers ahead. Enkidu spent long hours in conversation with the wild animals that still occasionally appeared at the city's edges, as if seeking their blessing for an expedition that would take him far from any natural environment he had ever known. The creature's responses, interpreted through the bond he had never completely severed with the natural world, seemed to convey both support for his courage and sorrow at his determination to face such peril. The final council meeting before their departure brought together all the wisdom and experience available in Uruk, as advisors, priests, military commanders, and skilled artisans offered their thoughts on the best strategies for success. The discussion revealed the unprecedented nature of their undertaking, as even the most knowledgeable scholars admitted that existing lore about Humbaba and the cedar forest was fragmentary and unreliable. What emerged from these deliberations was a plan that combined careful preparation with acceptance that much would depend on the hero's ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances. They would travel light enough to maintain speed and flexibility, but carry sufficient resources to sustain a prolonged campaign if necessary. Their route would take them through regions where friendly kingdoms might provide assistance, while avoiding territories controlled by rulers who might attempt to prevent or interfere with their mission. The night before their departure, Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood together on the palace roof, looking out over the city they loved and might never see again. The lights that twinkled in countless windows spoke of the lives they protected and the responsibilities they were temporarily abandoning in pursuit of immortal glory. The weight of their decision pressed upon them, but it couldn't diminish their excitement at the prospect of facing the ultimate test of their friendship and courage. As dawn approached and the time for departure drew near, the two friends completed their personal preparations with the solemnity of warriors who understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. Their weapons were blessed one final time, their provisions checked and rechecked, and their hearts steeled for whatever trials lay ahead in the distant forest where gods had set a guardian whose very name struck terror into the hearts of mortals. The quest that would define their legacy was about to begin, carrying them far from the safety of civilization into the unknown dangers of the wilderness, where their friendship would face its greatest test, and their courage would either earn them immortal fame or lead them to a doom that would be remembered as long as men told stories of heroes who dared to challenge the power of the gods themselves. The journey westward from Uruk began in the grey light of dawn, as Gilgamesh and Enkidu passed through the great gates of their city, accompanied by the prayers and blessings of their people. The road they followed was ancient beyond memory, worn by countless generations of merchants and travelers who had carried trade and news between the cities of Mesopotamia and the mysterious lands beyond the great rivers. But none of those previous wayfarers had ventured forth with the intention of challenging a supernatural guardian in his own domain. For the first days of their journey, the landscape remained familiar and comforting. Well-tended fields stretched away on either side of the road, their neat furrows speaking of the agricultural abundance that made civilization possible. Farmers working among their crops paused to wave at the magnificent warriors who passed by, their presence lending an air of safety and excitement to the ordinary routine of rural life. Small villages welcomed the heroes with feasts and celebrations, their inhabitants eager to show hospitality to men whose fame had spread throughout the known world. But as they traveled farther from the great rivers that nourished Mesopotamian civilization, the character of the landscape began to change in subtle ways that spoke of their approach to the boundaries of the human world. The fields became smaller and less regular, while the villages grew more scattered and their inhabitants more wary of strangers. The road itself, so well maintained near the major cities, began to show signs of neglect as fewer travelers ventured into these remote regions. The transition from the familiar world of human habitation to the wild lands where supernatural forces held sway was gradual but unmistakable. Cultivated plants gave way to wild grasses and scrub vegetation, while domesticated animals were replaced by creatures that watched the travelers with the wary intelligence of beings that had never known human dominion. The very air seemed to grow thicker and more charged with energy, as if the approaching forest exerted its influence far beyond its visible boundaries. Enkidu felt this change more acutely than his companion, his connection to the natural world, allowing him to sense the presence of powers that ordinary men could not detect. He spoke little during these latter stages of the journey. His attention focused on subtle signs that warned of the supernatural forces they were approaching. The tracks of animals in the soft earth beside streams showed creatures of unusual size and behavior, while the songs of birds carried melodies that seemed to speak of ancient secrets hidden in the depths of the forest. As they climbed into the foothills that marked the approach to the cedar forest, the landscape became increasingly dramatic and forbidding. Rocky outcroppings rose like ancient fortresses, their surfaces carved by wind and rain into shapes that seemed to represent sleeping giants or crouching beasts. Streams that had run clear and sweet in the lowlands now carried a mineral taste that spoke of deep springs fed by underground rivers flowing through chambers where no sunlight had ever penetrated. The first sight of the cedar forest itself struck both warriors with an awe that momentarily overwhelmed their courage and determination. The trees rose before them like living mountains, their massive trunks disappearing into a canopy so dense that it created an artificial twilight even at midday. The smallest of these giants dwarfed the largest trees that grew near human settlements, while the greatest among them seemed to support the very dome of heaven itself. But it was not merely the size of the trees that impressed and intimidated the two friends. The forest possessed an atmosphere of supernatural presence that made every shadow seem to conceal watching eyes, and every whisper of wind sound like the voice of an ancient god. The silence between the massive trunks was so profound that their own footsteps seemed like thunder, while their voices echoed with strange harmonics that suggested the presence of invisible listeners. The path that led into the forest depths was unlike any road they had ever traveled, carved not by human hands, but by forces that seemed to follow principles unknown to mortal engineers. It wound between the greatest trees in curves that created constantly changing vistas, each more magnificent and terrifying than the last. Strange flowers bloomed in the perpetual twilight beneath the canopy, their colors so vivid they seemed to glow with their own inner light. As they penetrated deeper into the sacred grove, both Gilgamesh and Enkidu began to experience the unsettling effects of prolonged exposure to supernatural forces. Their dreams, when they dared to sleep, were filled with visions of great eyes watching from among the trees and voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. During their waking hours, they caught glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when they turned to look directly. The wildlife of the forest was unlike anything either man had encountered, even in Enkidu's extensive experience with wild creatures. Deer with silver antlers grazed in clearings where ordinary sunlight never penetrated, while birds whose songs carried impossible harmonies nested in branches that seemed to reach toward divine realms. Most unsettling of all were the silent watchers, creatures whose forms remained indistinct, but whose presence could be felt whenever the travelers paused to rest. On the third day of their journey through the forest, they encountered the first clear sign of Humbaba's proximity. A clearing opened before them, where several massive cedars had been uprooted and arranged in a pattern that spoke of intelligence and purpose. The destruction was so complete and the display so deliberate that it could only have been the work of a being whose power far exceeded anything in normal experience. Enkidu examined the evidence with the tracking skills that had served him so well in his wilderness years, reading the signs that spoke of their quarry's nature and capabilities. The claw marks on the destroyed trees were longer than his forearm and deeper than his fist, while the footprints pressed into the forest floor suggested a creature of impossible size and weight. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of any scent trail, as if Humbaba moved through his domain without leaving any trace that normal senses could detect. The night they spent in this clearing was one of the most challenging either warrior had ever endured. The darkness beneath the cedar canopy was absolute, broken only by the strange luminescence of certain flowers and fungi that seemed to serve as the forest's own system of illumination. Sleep came fitfully and was filled with dreams that felt more real than waking consciousness, visions of ancient battles between gods and monsters that had shaped the very foundations of the world. It was during the darkest hour before dawn that they first heard Humbaba's voice, a sound like distant thunder that seemed to emerge from the earth itself rather than any particular direction. The demon's words, when they could be understood, were a mixture of warning and mockery that acknowledged their presence while questioning their sanity in daring to challenge his authority. The very trees seemed to tremble in response to their guardian's displeasure, while the strange flowers closed their petals as if seeking to hide from the approaching confrontation. Gilgamesh's response to this supernatural challenge revealed the depth of his royal courage and the strength of his divine heritage. Rising to his feet, despite the paralyzing fear that gripped lesser men who heard Humbaba's voice, he called out his own defiance in words that carried across the forest like a battle cry. He announced his identity as King of Uruk and descendant of gods, demanding that the guardian show himself for honorable combat rather than hiding in the shadows like a coward. The silence that followed this challenge was more terrifying than any threat, as if the entire forest held its breath in anticipation of what would come next. When Humbaba's laughter finally echoed through the trees, it carried a sound of such malevolent amusement that both warriors felt their blood turn cold. The demon's voice, when it came again, promised them deaths so prolonged and agonizing that their suffering would become part of the forest's eternal memory. But Enkidu's response to this threat showed that his loyalty to his friend had transformed his natural caution into something approaching divine recklessness. Standing beside Gilgamesh, with his hand on his friend's shoulder, he added his own voice to the challenge, speaking words that drew upon his deep understanding of the natural world and his commitment to protecting those he loved. His defiance carried a different quality than the king's royal arrogance, expressing instead the simple determination of someone who would not be intimidated by any force that threatened his chosen family. As dawn broke through the cedar canopy, with fingers of golden light that seemed to banish some of the forest's supernatural gloom, the two friends prepared for the confrontation that would determine their fate. Their weapons had been sharpened to perfection and blessed by every protective ritual they knew, while their hearts had been steeled by the knowledge that they faced this ultimate test together. Whatever came next, they would meet it as brothers united in courage and purpose. The sound of approaching footsteps, if such a term could be applied to the earth-shaking impacts that announced Humbaba's advance, began to echo through the forest like the beating of some gigantic heart. The guardian of the cedar forest was coming to meet the challenge they had offered, and the greatest battle in the history of the world was about to begin in the shadowed depths where gods had once walked among the trees they had created to mark the boundary between the mortal and divine realms. The moment when Humbaba finally emerged into the clearing where Gilgamesh and Enkidu waited was like the arrival of a living nightmare, a manifestation of primal terror that challenged every assumption about the natural order of the world. The guardian of the cedar forest appeared first as a disturbance in the very air itself, a shimmering that bent light around an impossible form before gradually resolving into a shape that defied description and overwhelmed comprehension. The demon stood 3 times the height of a normal man, his body a grotesque fusion of human and bestial characteristics that seemed to have been designed by malevolent gods as the embodiment of fear itself. His face blazed with an inner fire that made direct observation almost impossible, while his breath emerged as clouds of steam that carried the acrid scent of sulfur and burning metal. Most terrifying of all were his eyes, which held not the simple fury of an angry beast, but the cold intelligence of a supernatural being whose purposes transcended mortal understanding. The battle that followed was unlike any conflict in human history, a clash between mortal heroism and divine power that shook the very foundations of the forest and sent tremors through the earth that could be felt in distant lands. Humbaba's initial assault came not through physical contact, but through waves of supernatural terror that sought to paralyze his opponents with fear so profound that resistance would become impossible. But the bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu proved stronger than even demonic magic could break. When the king found himself momentarily overwhelmed by visions of cosmic horror that threatened to shatter his sanity, Enkidu's steady presence at his side provided an anchor to reality that allowed him to recover his courage. When the wild man was caught in webs of illusion that sought to convince him that his friend had already fallen, Gilgamesh's voice calling his name cut through the deception and restored his clarity of purpose. The physical combat that began when they closed with their supernatural opponent tested every skill and strategy they had developed during their years of friendship and training. Humbaba's strength was indeed beyond mortal measure, his blows capable of shattering rocks and uprooting trees with casual ease. But the two friends had learned to fight as a unit, their movements coordinated through countless hours of practice, and their strategies adapted to complement each other's particular strengths. Gilgamesh's divine heritage manifested itself in moments of transcendent courage and superhuman endurance that allowed him to stand against attacks that should have destroyed any mortal warrior. His weapons, blessed by the gods and forged by master craftsmen, bit deep into the demon's supernatural flesh and drew blood that steamed as it struck the forest floor. Each successful strike was paid for with tremendous effort and considerable risk, but the cumulative effect began to tell as the battle raged through the long hours of the morning. Enkidu's contribution to their victory came not only through his formidable strength, but through his deep understanding of natural forces and his ability to read the subtle signs that revealed Humbaba's weaknesses. The wild man's years of hunting and fighting in the wilderness had taught him to observe his opponents carefully, looking for the momentary lapses in attention or balance that could provide opportunities for decisive action. The turning point came when Enkidu noticed that Humbaba's supernatural fires dimmed slightly when clouds passed over the sun, suggesting that the demon's power was somehow connected to the celestial forces that governed day and night. This observation allowed the friends to time their most dangerous attacks for moments when their opponent's defenses were momentarily weakened, gradually wearing down the seemingly invincible guardian through accumulated small victories. But it was Gilgamesh who delivered the final blow, his great sword finding the one vulnerable spot in Humbaba's supernatural anatomy and striking with all the force that divine blood and royal training could provide. The demon's death cry echoed through the forest like the collapse of mountains, a sound of such anguish and fury that it seemed to tear the very fabric of reality and allow glimpses of the cosmic forces that shaped the world. The silence that followed Humbaba's fall was profound and unsettling, as if the entire forest struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. For thousands of years, the demon guardian had protected these sacred groves according to the will of Enlil, and his death represented a fundamental change in the order that had governed this realm since the beginning of time. The ancient cedar trees themselves seemed to mourn their fallen protector, their branches swaying in winds that carried the sound of distant lamentation. But the victory celebration of the two friends was short-lived, cut off by the appearance of a new presence that dwarfed even Humbaba's supernatural majesty. Enlil himself, the great god of storms and earth, manifested in the clearing with a wrath that made the very ground tremble beneath their feet. His anger at the death of his appointed guardian burned with the fury of hurricanes and earthquakes, while his disappointment in the mortals who had dared to challenge divine authority carried the weight of cosmic judgment. The god's curse, when it came, was delivered with the terrible finality of divine decree that could not be appealed or reversed. For their presumption in destroying the guardian he had set to protect the sacred forest, one of the two friends must die. The choice of which hero would pay this ultimate price was left to the fates themselves, those mysterious powers that governed destiny and determined the length of every mortal life. Gilgamesh's immediate response was to offer his own life in place of his friend's, his love for Enkidu overwhelming even his fear of death. The king's willingness to sacrifice himself for someone he valued more than his own existence moved even the angry god. But divine justice could not be swayed by mortal emotion, however noble. The curse had been pronounced and would be fulfilled according to the inexorable laws that governed the relationship between gods and men. Enkidu's reaction to the divine pronouncement revealed the depth of his own transformation from wild creature to civilized man. Instead of raging against the injustice of being punished for actions taken in loyal service to his friend, he accepted the curse with a dignity that honored both his natural nobility and his adopted humanity. His only regret was that his death would bring sorrow to Gilgamesh and deprive Uruk of the partnership that had brought such happiness to its people. The god's departure left the two friends alone in the clearing, with the enormity of what they had accomplished and the terrible price that would soon be demanded. They had achieved the victory they sought, proving their courage and strength against the ultimate supernatural challenge. The cedar forest lay open to them, its precious timber available for the great building projects that would make Uruk even more magnificent than before. But the joy of victory was poisoned by the knowledge that their friendship, which had given meaning to both their lives, was soon to be severed by forces beyond their control. They worked together to harvest the finest cedar logs, their familiar cooperation now shadowed by the understanding that each task they completed together might be their last. The timber they gathered would indeed become part of magnificent temples and palaces, but those structures would also serve as monuments to a partnership that had transformed them both. The journey back to Uruk took place under the weight of impending tragedy, though both heroes maintained the outward dignity appropriate to victorious warriors returning from a successful quest. The cities they passed through celebrated their achievement with feasts and ceremonies that acknowledged their status as the greatest heroes of their age. But the private moments between the friends were filled with conversations about mortality, legacy, and the meaning of a life well lived. As the familiar walls of their city came into view across the Mesopotamian plain, both Gilgamesh and Enkidu understood that they were returning not only as conquerors, but as men forever changed by their encounter with divine justice. The triumph they had won was real and magnificent, but it had come at a cost that would test the very foundations of everything they had built together. The final chapter of their friendship was about to begin, and its ending would reshape the king's understanding of what it meant to be human in a world governed by gods whose purposes remained forever mysterious to mortal minds. The seasons turned slowly in Uruk as the curse of Enlil worked its inexorable will upon Enkidu, the wild man who had become the king's beloved brother and the city's greatest protector. The illness that claimed him was unlike any malady known to mortal physicians, a supernatural wasting that seemed to draw the very life force from his magnificent body while leaving his mind cruelly clear and aware of his approaching fate. Day by day, the strength that had once matched gods diminished, until the hero who had wrestled with demons could barely rise from his bed. Gilgamesh's response to his friend's deteriorating condition was a desperate campaign against death itself, mobilizing every resource of his kingdom in a futile attempt to find some cure for divine punishment. The greatest healers from every corner of the known world were summoned to Uruk, their combined wisdom proving powerless against a curse that originated beyond a mortal realm. Priests conducted endless sacrifices and rituals, their prayers rising like smoke toward heaven while receiving no answer save the continued progress of the disease. The king's grief manifested itself in ways that revealed the depth of his transformation from tyrant to loving friend. He spent every possible moment at Enkidu's bedside, maintaining conversations that ranged from shared memories of their adventures to philosophical discussions about the nature of existence and the meaning of mortality. These talks provided comfort to both men, creating a space of intimacy and understanding that transcended the tragedy consuming their friendship. During the long nights when fever made sleep impossible, Enkidu would speak of the dreams that came to him in his delirium, visions of the underworld that awaited all mortals regardless of their achievements in life. He described a realm of dust and darkness, where kings and commoners alike were reduced to shadows of their former selves, where the glorious deeds that had defined their earthly existence became meaningless whispers in the eternal silence. These revelations terrified Gilgamesh more than any supernatural enemy they had faced together. The people of Uruk watched their king suffering with a mixture of sympathy and concern, understanding that the loss of Enkidu would mark the end of an era that had brought them unprecedented happiness and prosperity. The wild man's presence had been the catalyst for Gilgamesh's transformation from oppressor to beloved ruler, and his death might well signal a return to the dark days of tyrannical rule that had characterized the king's youth. But as the end approached, both friends found a strange peace in their acceptance of forces beyond their control. Enkidu's approaching death served as a teacher more profound than any philosopher, showing them both that mortality was not a curse to be fought, but a fundamental aspect of existence that gave meaning and urgency to every moment of life. The knowledge that their time together was limited made each conversation more precious, each shared glance more meaningful. The final conversation between the two friends took place in the palace garden, where they had spent so many peaceful hours, the familiar surroundings providing comfort during the most difficult moment of their lives. Enkidu, his once powerful frame, now reduced to little more than skin and bones, used his remaining strength to speak words that would haunt and guide Gilgamesh for the rest of his days. He spoke of love that transcended death, of friendship that created meanings larger than individual existence, and of the responsibility that survivors bore to honor the memory of those who had gone before. When death finally claimed the wild man who had become civilization's greatest champion, it came quietly in the pre-dawn hours when the city slept, and only Gilgamesh maintained his vigil. The king's grief at that moment was so profound that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace, his cries of anguish echoing through the corridors and awakening every soul in Uruk to the magnitude of their collective loss. The funeral ceremonies that followed Enkidu's death were the most elaborate in the city's history, befitting a hero whose achievements had earned him a place among the legendary figures of Mesopotamian lore. The wild man's body was prepared according to the most ancient traditions, wrapped in precious cloth and surrounded by the weapons and treasures that would accompany him on his journey to the underworld. The entire population of Uruk participated in the mourning rituals, their collective grief creating a symphony of lamentation that seemed to reach the very throne of the gods. But for Gilgamesh, no ceremony could adequately express the magnitude of his loss or provide comfort for a grief that transcended ordinary human experience. The king, who had once believed himself to be more god than man, now confronted the brutal reality of mortality in its most personal and devastating form. The friend who had been his anchor to humanity was gone, leaving him adrift in a world that suddenly seemed empty of meaning and purpose. The obsession with immortality that consumed Gilgamesh in the months following Enkidu's death was the logical extension of his inability to accept the fundamental limitation that defined mortal existence. If gods could live forever, if divine blood flowed in his veins, surely there must be some way to escape the fate that had claimed his beloved friend. The search for eternal life became his driving passion, overwhelming every other consideration, and transforming him once again into someone his subjects barely recognized. The journey that eventually took Gilgamesh to the ends of the earth in search of immortality was itself a kind of death, a rejection of the life and responsibilities he had in favor of an impossible dream. He abandoned his kingdom, his people, and everything that had given his existence meaning in pursuit of a goal that would ultimately prove as illusory as the desert mirages that led travelers astray. The very pursuit of immortality became a form of living death, cutting him off from the human connections that had made his life worthwhile. It was only after years of wandering and countless failed attempts to achieve eternal life that Gilgamesh finally began to understand the wisdom that Enkidu's death had been trying to teach him. Mortality was not humanity's curse, but its greatest gift, the force that made love precious, friendship meaningful, and achievement significant. The knowledge that life was limited created the urgency that drove people to build cities, create art, and form the bonds of affection that made existence bearable. The king's eventual return to Uruk marked the beginning of his final transformation, from a man consumed by the fear of death to a ruler who understood that true immortality lay not in the preservation of individual life, but in the creation of lasting legacies that would benefit future generations. The city he had abandoned in his grief welcomed him back with joy, but they also sensed the profound change that his trials had wrought in his character. The reign that followed Gilgamesh's return was marked by a wisdom and compassion that surpassed even the golden years of his partnership with Enkidu. The king who had learned to accept mortality became the greatest ruler in Mesopotamian history, creating laws and institutions that would govern civilized society for millennia. His understanding of human nature, deepened by loss and refined by suffering, enabled him to create a kingdom that truly served the needs of its people. The walls of Uruk that Gilgamesh built during these final years of his reign became symbols of the permanence that mortal achievement could attain, structures so magnificent and enduring that they would outlast the civilization that created them. The code of laws he established became the foundation for justice systems throughout the ancient world, while the cultural institutions he supported preserved knowledge and art for countless future generations. As his own death approached in the fullness of time, Gilgamesh faced it with the serenity of someone who had learned that true victory lay not in avoiding mortality, but in embracing it fully. He had discovered that the meaning of life came not from its duration, but from its depth, not from personal immortality, but from the love and service that created connections transcending individual existence. The epic poem that preserved his story for posterity became itself a form of immortality more lasting than any magical elixir could have provided. Through the power of human memory and artistic creation, the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu continued to inspire and instruct countless generations who faced their own struggles with mortality, loss, and the search for meaning in a world governed by forces beyond human control. In the end, the greatest king of the ancient world learned the lesson that every human being must ultimately master. That life's brevity was what made it precious, that love's vulnerability was what made it powerful, and that the acceptance of mortality was the beginning of true wisdom. The wild man who had come from the forest to transform a tyrant into a hero had given his friend the greatest gift possible: the understanding that being human, with all its limitations and sorrows, was itself a form of divine blessing. The evening breeze that whispered through the cedar beams of Uruk's temples carried with it the eternal reminder that all things pass away, but also the comforting truth that love, friendship, and the courage to face life's challenges could create meanings that transcended the boundaries of individual existence. In learning to live fully within the constraints of mortality, Gilgamesh had achieved the only immortality that truly mattered: the preservation of his story and its lessons in the hearts and minds of all who came after him. Thus ends our journey with the mighty Gilgamesh, King of Uruk, whose quest for immortality taught him that the greatest treasures of human existence are found not in escaping our mortal nature, but in embracing it fully. May his story remind us that friendship, courage, and the acceptance of life's natural rhythms can transform even the briefest existence into something eternal and magnificent. The end. Thank you for joining the Sleepy Historian on this ancient adventure through the world's first epic tale. Sleep peacefully, and may your dreams be filled with the timeless wisdom of heroes who learned that true immortality lies not in the length of our days, but in the depth of our love and the courage with which we face each precious, fleeting moment.